that's a lot better. The famed bank robber, John Dillinger, when he robbed the Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana, back in the early 30s, it was the largest robbery at the time. Netted $75,000, which in today's dollars, that's $1.4 million. During the robbery, there was an elderly foreign-born woman who was not to be deterred by her vision to get out of that bank and on to where she needed to go. Now, she couldn't go out the front door, so she decided to go out the back door, but there was a gang member of the Dillinger Bank right there, and pointed a gun at her and says, "You better get inside, lady." And with that, this elderly foreign-born woman looked at him and said, "I go to Penny's, and you can go to hell." And with that, brushed the gun off and walked down the bank, or walked down the side undeterred. She was not to be deterred by her vision. So, we're going to, today's scripture passage, and I apologize, is only going to be verses 1 through 7. And we're going to break it up a few times to kind of get us a sense of the feel of the book of Revelation. So Max is going to read to us the first 4 verses of chapter 21 right now.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away."
Thank you. Today begins a new sermon series called Hope and the Epistles. Now, you might remember last summer we talked about faith, and we lifted up the Old Testament texts. And so what we're doing is we're talking about what I call Paul's Trinity of faith, hope, and love. Which means that this summer we're talking about hope. And we're lifting up specifically the passages out of our epistle readings. And to sweeten your appetite for this sermon series, we're going to begin with 4 sermons directly talking about the last 2 chapters of the Bible. And that means the last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation. Now, I'm the first to admit that this is a controversial book. I also know that this is a very misunderstood book. Authors and movie producers have taken a lot of liberty with its pages. If you just think the Left Behind series is a perfect example of this. And so, but when you sit down and you pore over these lessons, however, something different comes across. This is, in the book of Revelation, a message of dreaming big. This is a message of not holding back. This is a message of not being deterred by your vision. And when you look at this book, it is a message about hope. It's like the story once I heard about a gentleman that was crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And it was a long and arduous passage. And he spent most of the time just hanging over the railing, just getting greener and greener. And finally, a steward came up to him and says, "Oh, don't be discouraged, sir. No one's ever died of seasickness." And the very nauseous passenger kind of looked up at the steward and says, "Oh, don't say that. It is only the hope of dying that has kept me alive this long." Now, I want to say something. There seems to be some confusion concerning the hope that I want to talk about when it comes to the book of Revelation. Because it seems that some believe that hope from the book of Revelation has to do with saving us from something awful. It's kind of like the bumper sticker I'm sure you've seen. "Live your life so the preacher won't have to lie at your funeral." Isn't that how Revelation gets interpreted? If you're not good enough, if you're not holy enough, if you're not forgiven enough, if you're not godly enough, then you're going to suffer the consequences at that final battle. Have you heard this interpretation? It doesn't matter that this book was written 1,800 years ago. It doesn't matter that every single symbol that is lifted up in this book refers to the Roman Empire. And talk about symbolism. It's almost as if the book of Revelation is written in code. almost to the idea that it's like that the author really didn't want to say what was on his mind. And how we know this comes from the book of Revelation. Just look at chapter 11, verse 8. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically, or it could mean also allegorically, or spiritually called. So we get a sense here that this is a book about symbolism, an allegory. This is a book that, if it is not understood in its historical context, can have strange and often unusual consequences. Take, for instance, probably the most famous passage of them all, chapter 13, verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of a person. Its number is, we all know the number, 666. Now, I would like us to do that. All of you have pew Bibles in front of you, or maybe you brought your Bible with you. So why don't you go ahead and turn to Revelation 13:18. And it'll be pretty easy. It's just pull out. It's the very last book of the Bible, and you just keep turning until you get to 13:18. I'll give you just a second to turn to that. Now, when you're looking at Revelation 13:18, specifically the number 666, do you notice that there might be a letter or an asterisk or a number or something that's kind of referring you to something else? Now, it might say, other ancient authorities read 616. So it might be 666. It also might be 616. But here's the interesting thing. That notation hasn't deterred some people, such as a former president. Ronald and Nancy Reagan, when they left the White House and moved into the retirement community in Southern California, they didn't change their address because it began 616. They changed their address because it began 666. And Fred Phelps, who was the pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, who I even strain to call a pastor, because many times his family is used to protest at the funerals of our fallen soldiers. He runs every 4 years for the mayor of Topeka because the zip code of Topeka begins 666. So the problem that we run into here is that in Greek and Roman alphabet, numbers and letters have the same symbol. We all know this when you look at I and V and X. It's also the only way that we know what Super Bowl it is, right? And we use Arabic numbers, and so we don't quite understand. So if we were able to take Roman symbols, and which means numbers and letters, and we kind of look at something kind of interesting, Neron, Caesar, equals 666 using the Roman characters. But here's the deal. No one ever knew him as Neron, at least with that N. So if you took that out, Nero Caesar equals 616. Now, with all of this evidence, and with all of this scholarship, the book of Revelation still is dark literature. And is still, and I hear this from people, packed too full of symbolism. And I'll admit, it is difficult to read. And so when someone comes along and says, hey, I'll interpret this for you, many follow along. And when someone does this to you, I want you to do two things. One, I want you to run, because it does no good to argue with them. And two, I want you to realize something, that if you fall into that trap, you miss why John is writing this letter. For instance, look at verse 11, right at the very beginning, chapter 1. So write in the book that you see and send it to the 7 churches. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These were churches. These were people facing huge amounts of persecution. This, as I said, is the time of Nero, when things are intense, violent, and horrible maltreatment was taking place. This is the time of the lions. This is a time when Rome burned, and who got the blame? Who became the scapegoats? It was the Christians. The Christians were the easy targets because they didn't fight back. Who does the bully attack on the playground? The one who doesn't fight back. And also these Christians, they're a bit suspect. They're not very loyal because they don't worship Roman gods. Now, I believe that if I was a Christian at that time, I'd probably begin questioning my own faith. If I was faced with these lions and denouncing my beliefs, I'd probably find it kind of tempting. When the going got tough and my life was on the line, I might be like a lot of people and run instead of fight. But for those of you who stayed, John is writing to you. Now, it might be in code because you never know who's reading over your shoulder. But those of you who stay and fight for what you believe in, John has a message for you. Those who are questioning why you're doing this, John has a message for you. Those of you being persecuted and beaten and tortured for just being a Christian, John is talking to you in the last 2 chapters of the Bible. And he is saying that you win. He is saying things are tough right now. Things are horribly tough. You might be in the muck of life, but there will be a new Jerusalem. And you will live in it. John is saying, don't give up on hope now. John is saying something better is coming. John is saying, look, see, a new world is coming. Get ready for it. Look, see this vision of what is possible. In the book, Unity of All Life, there's a story of a man who's been working for his company for about 20 years. And he's sitting at this desk, and he realizes he's just been laid off. And he's thinking of all the things that he's brooding about his life, and he realizes that he's probably not going to get hired at his age. He wasn't going to live off that limited income. And he begins to realize that he might not be no longer needed. He might be useless and thoroughly washed up. Sounds like a lot of men we know in our society, doesn't it? And as he's sitting there at this desk, he notices a spider. And so he just kind of brushes that spider off. But all of a sudden he notices that the spider kind of spins a web and he doesn't see where it goes. And then the spider kind of gently drops down to the ground. And he begins to wonder, if this tiny creature could get into the flow of something mysterious and deal so creatively within its crisis, then couldn't he do the same? And so his thinking begins to change as his own circumstances around him begins to change. He might not get his old job back, but he certainly is going to be able to move forward and maybe even on to something better. I'm going to ask Max to read us verse 5 now.
And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true."
My dad is a huge Dodgers fan. If you want to know anything about the Dodgers, you talk to my dad. And this goes all the way back to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, my dad will, when he talks about the Brooklyn Dodgers, says that he learned about baseball and the law of averages from the great hitter, Duke Snider. Now, Duke was a powerful hitter, and in his prime, he was hitting .330. That meant that he got a hit every time out of 3 times that he was up at bat. Well, one night, several of the Dodgers, including Duke, was to be invited over to dinner at the famed preacher, Norman Vincent Peale, for dinner. Now, Peale, as he tells the story, wasn't able to attend the game, but he wanted something to talk about, so he decides to listen to the first inning on the radio. And Duke Snider comes up to bat. Now, I will tell you, Judge Randall told me that Duke was a left-hander. I batted right-handed when I showed the illustration, so Randall told me I should do this left-handed. He was a lefty, and when he in the first inning of this game that Peale was listening to, you hear this whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He struck out in the first inning. And Peale's thinking to himself, hey, I got a lot to do. And so he turns off the radio. But that night, Duke Snyder comes over to the house along with these other Dodgers, and Duke seems happy and relaxed. Here's how Peel tells the story. Duke, Peel said, I heard you strike out in the first inning today. Oh, he said, did you hear the game all the way through? No, what happened? I struck out in the fourth inning as well. You amaze me, Duke. You struck out twice, you, the great Duke Snyder, and it doesn't seem to bother you at all. How come? Well, said Duke, I take comfort from the law of averages. I hit about 330. And on that basis, I'm going to strike out about 90 times a season. That's just the way it is. So, after the game this afternoon, I went into the clubhouse and I was happy. I said to myself, isn't it great? I only have 88 more times to strike out this season. Let's listen to Max as he concludes our passage, verses 6 and 7.
Then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children.
Thank you, Max. John is assuring these people who are quite young in their faith that God's holding you. God's giving you something great, something incredible, something absolutely unbelievable to look forward to. John's interpretation of hope here is that God is laying out this promise, that God is providing this vision, and that God is giving us the strength, the wherewithal, the ability to see through the muck, through all the tragedy of the world, and to see what is absolutely possible. A new Jerusalem, a place with no death and no pain. He says it's a place where the old will pass away and the new will be so glorious that it'll give you strength to endure anything. The old will pass away and the new will be so glorious that it'll give you a vision to know that what you're doing is right. The old will pass away and the new will be so incredible that it'll be the vision of what you need to survive. Can you see it? This new Jerusalem. Can you see this vision of what's to come? There's a story about a family that is awakened by the smoke detector, and the worst fears are imagined. The house is on fire. And the dad runs upstairs to get his two kids, and he grabs the 18-month-old in his arms, and he's carrying the 4-year-old by the arm. As they're going down halfway down the stairs, the 4-year-old realizes that he forgot his teddy bear. And he wriggles his way free, and he gets back up to his bedroom. But in the confusion and the panic of the whole situation, the dad doesn't realize that the 4-year-old is not with him until he's outside. But by then, it's too late. The fire and the smoke, it's too much. And so the son, he goes to an open window, and he yells, Daddy, Daddy, help me. And the father just looks up at him and says, jump out the window, I'll catch you. But in the darkness and the smoke, the boy can't see him, and he yells back, but Daddy, I can't see you. And the dad just shouts back, that's okay, son. I can see you. John is asking you to jump not into the unknown, but into something that only God can see. This new Jerusalem. God sees a wonderful place. God sees hope. God sees peace. God's laying out this vision of what to jump into. Are you ready to jump into this vision of what God lays out? Now, we're going to learn something next week. That jumping requires something of us. Something that we must do. But that's for next week. Right now, I just want you to bask in the glow. That God is going to catch you and hold you. Because God's laying out this vision